Welcome to Reframed. Join us as we explore the concept of redemptive business in our unique context on the African continent.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Chinwe Okpala, and I currently work in the international development space. I have been working in corporate world before then. I started out with financial services. I worked in investment banking, commercial banking, and merchant banking. And then from there, I moved on to fast moving consumer goods. And now I am in the development space, which honestly has been quite an interesting and exciting journey. We are going to be discussing on how we reframe risk and why it's important and the different perspectives, or should I say, perceptions that people have when it comes to risk. I have come to realize that different people have different connotation of risk. And sometimes it seems to also cut across probably different geography on the continent. So speaking specifically for the West African continent or West African part of the continent, sometimes it appears that there's this averse alert response that you get whenever you mention risk because people are thinking reputational risk, compliance, while some others sometimes get excited by it when they hear risk. They're thinking entrepreneurial spirit, venture capitalism, growth, possibilities, opportunities. So we've come to realize that there are varied nuances and responses when it comes to that word in itself, risk. And we are hoping that through this conversation, we can reframe, not just reframe, but also understand and equip our listeners to be able to ask the right questions while we are also being grounded on the principles that guide our professional ethos and responsibility. And it's very important that this nuance and this context, when it comes to both taking risk, managing risk, would help us to drive and focus this conversation specifically looking at it through the lens of West Africa. Now I'm going to introduce our guest, and his name is Nissi Ekpott. Nissi, I hope I got your name right, but we'll just go with Nissi for the purpose of this conversation. Nissi grew up in Nigeria, but he's currently living in South Africa, and he has passion when it comes to enterprise development, and that led him to start a business called BizConnect in Africa in 2005. He co-founded Grow My Home, a community of real estate investors who pool their resources to provide access to affordable home ownership in Nigeria, in Kenya, and South Africa. Nissi, I'm curious to see if you're looking to expand beyond this, but first of all, welcome. It's exciting to have you here. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast today. Over to you, Nissi. Welcome, and it's good to have you. Tell us more about yourself.
Thank you very much, Chinwe. Good to be on your podcast today, and good to talk to you. Looking forward to talking about the topic at hand. My wife always reminds me that I must never forget to tell my audience that I'm married to her, and we have two lovely daughters. so yes, that's another thing about myself that you might have been left out there. I'm very passionate about developing Africa. Hopefully, in our lifetime, we'll be able to see that happen. But at the very least, leaving for the next generation the tools to be able to move the continent forward. I'm a child of God, very passionate about the things of the kingdom. I'm just passionate about adding value to people in doing business as I'm passionate about social enterprise. I probably did it long before I understood that there was a whole theory about it. That's myself in a nutshell.
Can you talk to us briefly about your life and your journey growing up in Nigeria? Because right now you live in South Africa, but you grew up in Nigeria. Can you talk briefly about that and what informed the transition? Was it business? Was it family? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I live in South Africa in terms of geography, but I probably live in both countries because I am as updated in Nigeria as anybody who lives in Nigeria because I run an active business there and I kind of go between both countries. But yes, I grew up in Nigeria. I think the whole story about my life just goes back to my parents and grandparents. I grew up to always see my parents involved in social initiatives. My father was a CEO, but he was also involved in. I mean, we ran a school in the community, free hospitals in the community, stuff like that. So we actually inherited that school and still run it. It's been running for 50 years now. So that was kind of like something that shaped us as a people. We grew up, I would have described myself as one of those kind of people that never thought they would live outside of Nigeria, because that's how my parents raised us to be kind of nationalistic, But, sometimes God, never say never, God always has his ways. So somewhere in 2001, I heard the Lord say to me, go to Cape Town. It was a big paradigm shift for me at the time, but long story cut short, I took the journey. Initially in obedience. At that time, I was actually in a missions. I had finished university 2 years before then, and I was working in the church missions. And but I came, and on hindsight, I can see why the Lord did that. One of the reasons was to play my role in being able to facilitate the relationship between the two countries. Because being a Pan-Africanist, I realized that the relationship between those two countries is key to lifting the continent.
Thank you. I have more questions, but we'll keep this going. So you started out saying that you're raised as a nationalist, and then you ended up saying that you're a Pan-Africanist. So it seems like there was a shift both in your mindset and in your approach. And from your profile, you started BizConnect in 2005. So it sounds like that happened after you made the move. So how was that transition? I mean, that's what you would typically call for a business person taking a risk when you're in a position or a place where you have been raised with a particular mindset and things are probably even going well and fine. And then you said you hear God. Sounds like an Abraham situation. Okay, leave your father and your mother's house to a place I'm going to show you. Can you shed more light on that?
Yeah, thanks, Chinwe. I can see you. I must say you are very good at asking very interesting questions. I've never thought about that shift and transition. But now that you asked that question, I actually remember that somewhere in as a nationalistic person, Nigeria was my world all through my growing up years. And as like most Nigerians, we did geography and stuff, and I was fond of those things. So we knew about the rest of the world, but it was just knowledge. But somewhere around 2002 or thereabouts, or 2000, but the early 2000s, I remember reading Isaiah chapter 52. And it sounds very strange. You might actually look at it and not see what I'm saying. But I remember reading Isaiah chapter 52, and I felt the Lord was speaking to me about Africa. And that just created a big shift in my mind. And I suddenly realized that I needed to not just look at things from the Nigerian context, but to expand my course to look at things from the African context. And then following that, you know how it is when God begins to direct you to something, your attention goes there and you see more. I began to become aware of a lot of Africa, this is your time words, kind of the way. There was a kind of upswell around that time. One of the biggest ones that happened was a conference in Johannesburg in the year 2000. I wasn't then in Johannesburg, but I heard about it. And it was a message, a prophetic word by a man called Gunnar Olson. J. Gunnar Olson was the founder of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce. It's a global organization founded in Europe, but they were having a conference in Johannesburg. And he read this famous Africa, this is your time prophecy, and then described the next generation of Africa. And reading those words inspired me so much that I decided that I was no longer going to just be centered on one country, but I was going to be centered on the continent as a whole. So yes, BizConnect Africa and many other initiatives I've done which are Africa related were birthed out of that, and trying to relate to everything I do from a continental perspective rather than from a country perspective.
That's very interesting. Thank you for shedding more light on that. And it sounds like the shifts first started with your mindset, and then it translated to the actions that you took to move beyond one country to taking a continental approach. Now, tell us, what has changed since you started business back then and now?
A lot has changed, Chinwe. A lot has changed. So one thing that comes to mind, for example, is I remember when we tried to set up a telephone, get a telephone in Nigeria in 2000. And there were 250,000 telephone lines in the whole country. I remember that we were on a queue for 3 months, and I had to go to the telephone office every day to lobby to try and be put on that queue so that we could communicate overseas. That was one of the key things that affected us. When I moved to South Africa newly and then tried to start a business as a starter, I remember having to look for telephone booths and having to look for quiet ones that didn't have a lot of traffic so that I could do business and call offices and they wouldn't know I was calling from a telephone booth. I mean, those are things we take for granted today. I remember going to expensive cyber cafes and paying 30 Rand per hour or something like that and making expensive phone calls across the country. I mean, today we do all of that on our cell phones and it's very easy. I remember making payments and there were no payment systems between the countries. And we had to go to the kind of business we were doing where we were buying and selling equipment. We were buying equipment and machines from South Africa and selling them to clients in countries like Nigeria, DRC, and all that. And a lot of times we had to do these transactions in cash because there was little or no inter-country payments. The risk involved, the suspicion involved. I remember going with a client to buy products somewhere in Johannesburg, and this client came with cash. And I mean, these people probably thought we were criminals or something. So you had to deal with all that kind of stigma, the difficulties, the risk of carrying large sums of money, no proper insurance. So we still have business challenges, but we sometimes forget that we now transfer money from country to country on our phones. We have telephones easily. We make cheap phone calls. We do far more than what we used to do then. So a lot has shifted, and I could go on and on. I could give you so many examples, but yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.
Putting into perspective what you just shared in terms of having to carry large sums of money, and I mean, looking at things now, when you're traveling, if you even have beyond, say, $10,000 on you, you would have to explain why you would even need that much cash on hand because there are now systems that have been automated. Like you said, you can do transactions all over the world without restrictions. So, how did you manage those barriers, and with the perception also you could have been easily misunderstood or even confused for a criminal, especially when you're doing this across countries, not even within a particular location? How did you navigate that? And would you say that, can you point to an example where you would say that God was with me and God helped me through this?
One of the greatest ways God helped me at the start was that I had a mentor. This was a 60-something-year-old South African lady. She's late now, Jennifer Becker. We called her Mother of Africa. She had this business that she took care of people from all over the continent and traveled all these countries that people thought were dangerous to go to. So she gave me a desk, a phone, and a system and just trained me on business. And so that helped me very early to know about things like due diligence, risk, the potential of being seen as a criminal. So we tried as much as possible, despite all this risk, to keep paper trails of what we were doing. And we tried as much as possible to carry out private due diligence checks on people so that we wouldn't become mules for drug dealers or fraudsters or stuff like that. But still, it was what it was. That's the reality. So, I mean, I don't really want to mention numbers, but I'll give you an example or two examples God helped us. In one instance in South Africa, I hosted a delegation of about 60 business leaders. And every one of them, and this was well-to-do business leaders. So we had to take care of their accommodation, their transport, and some of the things they bought that ran into a lot of money. And they all arrived with cash in the airport and just gave us, myself and my team, all the cash and said, take care of us. So here were we having to pay for accommodation for days for 50 people. We literally had it was just, we had to get the bureau to change. It was in Forex. We had to get the bureau to change to move to our hotel because we said we wouldn't take the money on the road. And the bureau de change guys came over to the hotel, and they parked in the basement and did all the money transfers, and we paid the hotel. Hotels are used to things like that. Actually, you actually would be surprised to know that they are not surprised. They've dealt with all these kinds of clients. We had to get my brother, who was on our team, and one of our team members to stay in the hotel room with the cash, and the room was never cleaned. We just put a sign, "Don't clean," on the room, because a cleaner seeing that volume of money could report you to criminals. And then we had to do so at least for the first 3 or 4 days, until we could dispense all the money to the hotel, to the various transport companies, to the products they wanted to buy, etc. So in all of this, you are being protected by God. Anybody can be a weak link when there's a lot of money. Even people that could be good people could become bad people if they are motivated by money. So that's protection. Another example was, we supplied a client, we helped them to build a clothing industry. So we supplied them a whole range of, sewing machines and industrial machines and stuff like that. This was in the city of Uyo in Nigeria. But when it was time for the client to pay us, the balance, he didn't pay us in Uyo. He said we should come to his place in Port Harcourt to collect the money. And there were no bank transfers and all that at the time. So, that was just funny. And then we have to fly out. So when he told us that, I had to select a flight from Owerri, which is probably about 150 kilometers from Port Harcourt, or 100 kilometers. And so we went to Port Harcourt, and this guy, I thought he was going to give us a check. At least I would go to Lagos and cash it and reduce the risk. This guy gave us a bag of money. No. This guy gave us a check that we could only cash in Port Harcourt. He was completely unperturbed. So we had to cash this money in Port Harcourt, and then it was, what, those Ghana bags. I don't like saying the full terminology. So I called them Ghana bags. Those Ghana bags. We had a boot full of these things. Myself, my colleague, who was the technical installer who set up the equipment, there were two of us, two colleagues, and then we drove from Port Harcourt to Owerri. If I had known this guy was going to give us money in Port Harcourt, I would have booked a flight from Port Harcourt, and it would be the same city. But now we had to drive this 150 kilometers. And then I remember one point, the driver saw policemen. And because he had fetched us, you try to lower the risk. So we get the taxi driver to come. You choose a random driver, so there's no room for planning anything. You get him to come to the bank. And then they drive into the private entrance of the bank. We negotiate all of this, and then they put the money in the car. And then you get him to drive us. And so he sees this policeman, and he tries to stop, in panic, knowing that they will say, "Open your boots." And I remember the guy beside me says, "Don't stop, keep going." And and I'm praying in my heart, because this is policemen back then in the middle of nowhere. You don't even know if it's a genuine checkpoint or an illegal one. And surprisingly and shockingly, these guys didn't stop us. It's as if they didn't even see us. So we had many of those kind of incidents. Sorry, one more example. I remember traveling to Ghana to do a transaction, and then we came back on the road through Benin Republic border, semi-border. And as we got to Lagos border, we had cleared, stamped our passports, and a guy walks up to me. Something I would normally do, I would normally not do. He walks up to me and stretches his hand and asks for my bag. And I feel compelled to give him my box. So he takes myself and my colleague, my partner, are traveling. He takes my box, he rolls it to an SUV. He puts it in there and he says, "Where are you going?" And we say, "Lagos Airport." That's when the bombings and stuff like that started in Nigeria. This guy drives from that place to Lagos Airport, and there are over 25 checkpoints. He doesn't stop at one, and we are not stopped at one. Not even one checkpoint stops us. When we get to the airport and we come out of the car, my friend turns around to me and tells me, "Was that a human being or an angel?" Because it's unusual for that to happen. We look at his windscreen, there is no military sticker or police sticker, there is nothing. He just gets there and he's talking, he's very gentle and drives past. And, so these are the kind of risks that one had to face when there were no systems, that could lower those kind of things. But as young business people, we had to grow. And I don't know whether I'll do that today.
It was not just highly risky, it was quite dangerous, but still sums up in one sentence: God kept you. And it just validates that when you have a leading, when God sends you, He shields you, He protects you, He keeps you.
If I may make one point that to what you said, when I tried to open a bank account, when it became possible to begin to wire money, and I tried to open a bank account in Uyo, which was the city I was based in, we went around many banks. The bank officers at the time told us nobody wires money from outside there. They say you are the first person. So people only receive money here. So we literally were one of the few people once there was an opportunity to be able to do I mean, in Lagos it was there, electronic wire transfers abroad. So yes, to buttress your point, the moment there was an option, we seized it with both hands.
So that also means that even our perception and our mindset and our approach to risk should also be evolving as things change. And it brings me to my next question on the fact that people have different associations based on either lived experiences or stories, predominant stories that they have either seen or heard when it comes to the word risk. I mentioned earlier when we're starting out the podcast that we are trying to reframe this conversation when it comes to the perception of risk. So I'd like you to share your view. There's been that perception of sometimes people being averse and not wanting to identify with the nuance, and sometimes even perceived stigma that comes with using that word in some climes within the African continent, while in some other areas there's a more adventurous, open-minded, and entrepreneurial approach for someone who has lived on two different geographical areas of the continent, being the West and the South. What's your take on that?
For somebody who is trained or who has studied business, I would say, when you say risk, I actually immediately think of business risk, financial risk in investing. So I need to actually remind myself talking of reframing, I need to remind myself to expand the coast of the conversation to all forms of risk, like you've asked. And I would want to say that risk is a part of life. I mean, even when we gave examples of money transfers, as much as things have improved, even making a wire transfer still has an element of risk. And we've experienced that, So at every point in time, even in any transaction, you always have to say, Lord, I commit this transaction to your hand. So life and risk, because we cannot see the future, life and risk are realities. However, there are different kinds of risk. We can mitigate them, we can manage them, and there are different aspects of risk. And my experience has been, that different parts of the continent react to different aspects of life differently. So some people are strong in the area of social risk, but will not do adventure. So, for example, West Africans will cross the ocean on a boat to go to Europe. That is an extremely. I actually had a friend in university who did that, and he was caught in North America, and he was brought back to school, and he went back. We thought he was completely crazy, out of this world, but that guy wouldn't try to sail around the world in a kayak. But South Africans might not cross. It will be very rare. I've never heard of a South African taking that kind of risk. But South Africans will do abseiling, bungee jumping, not far from my house. People are jumping from that place every day. If I took my West African friend who took a risk to come there, and I tell him to jump from that mountain, he will tell me he doesn't want to give the witches in his village an opportunity. So different sections of life, different kinds of risks. The principles are the same, but people will take risk in some areas and not in other areas. Probably it's wired in culture, wired in upbringing, wired in understanding, wired in the fact that maybe ambition or desire drives what people will accept and what they will not accept.
Now, that's an interesting perspective when it comes to how you have talked about and shaped this, how sometimes in some areas of the same continent, people will take risk that would seem illogical to another part of the same continent. And while Some other people will take risk that will just seem highly unreasonable. So you're not willing to go bungee jumping as a Nigerian, but you're willing to cross the desert and Mediterranean just to, in quote, in seeking a better life, even at the expense of the life that you are living. They know some people that take that journey, they know that they might never return, but it's a risk they are willing to take. And for someone that is not even willing to do skydiving, bungee jumping, kayaking, it just validates what you said, that risk is actually about perception. For me, personally, there's also a part of risk that, at least when it comes to taking what I would call reasonable risk, in spite of the perception of our environment, our nurture and upbringing, now bringing it to our posture as Christians, there are a lot of times I've realized that taking risks, or should I say, taking spirit led risks, sometimes can make you look crazy, illogical, unreasonable until things start shaping up. How did Abraham have the conversation with Sarah? When he wakes up one day, I'm like, okay, pack up, pack up, pack up, we're leaving. And she's like, where are we going? I honestly don't know. Let's just go. God said we should go. Like, how do you explain that? There's a part of taking risks for us, especially as Christians in business, in the workplace, that hinges very strongly on obedience. What do you think about that? And can you probably also share? I mean, you shared a lot of stories that I'm still processing, honestly. But I believe that for us as Christians, when we want to reframe risk, there's a huge part of it that hinges on obedience.
Different people deal with risks differently depending on their personality type. So that's a factor. And so there are some people who it is very difficult for you to get them to, who are naturally risk averse. And you just need to manage them. You cannot, if you can create an emotional crisis if you try to over push them. Having said that, and while we always try to manage risk as much as possible, as a Christian, I don't think it's possible to walk in the fullness of what God has in our lives without risk. In fact, the moment you say yes to God, you're going to be exposed, whether you like it or not, you're going to be exposed to some element of things that others would consider risky in your own space. You said the example of Abraham. I wanted to add that he was 75 when he did that crazy move. I mean, I have a mother who is around that age. I'm just wondering how I would feel if my mom told me she was relocating to somewhere she doesn't know at her age. I would fly down home immediately and and then talk to her. Yeah, but having said that, and then I think when you look at the Bible, we have the Bible to back us. There is no Bible story. Okay, let me not say there is no. There is hardly a Bible story that doesn't have elements of risk around it. And you're right. It is crazy until it happens, until it is real. But even in the world outside of the Bible, most of the great stories most of the things we enjoy, most of the technologies we enjoy are laced with huge risk involved. The airplane, if you've watched the story of these technologies, people took tremendous risk. People lost their lives. Taking an injection for the first time. Can you imagine the risk involved when you don't know what that thing is going to do to you? So it's part of life. And as Christians, what we need to then try to do is to be able to link risk to obedience. So we have to be able to separate between presumption and obedience. I think that's the biggest thing. So once you can separate that, then it becomes a risk worth taking, or it becomes foolishness. So presumption is foolishness, leads to foolishness, and obedience leads to divinely backed risks.
I like the way you wrapped that in. Presumption and obedience. I would probably also add presumption, popular opinion, and obedience to God. Now, we're going to segue into a different part of this conversation, which is the word purpose beyond profit. We hear that a lot. We talk about it, purpose beyond profit, especially in the context of redemptive business. What does that phrase mean to you?
All of my life, I have grown up in a family that I've been shaped that way. So my father, just to give context, in a phase in my life, my father was the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the country. So we grew up, you understand how that kind of phase can be. But I always saw that in all, and being a CEO, you do very well, you understand, financially. But I always saw that in all my dad's transactions, there was always this thing where he thought about well-being, well-being of the community, well-being of the people. They had departments in the company that their job was just to find projects, jobs, or deals to give people, just to do well-being. So that's why we had schools and guest houses and free housing and all those kinds of things. So he always tried to tell us that we had a mandate to develop. He, for a long time in his life, he wasn't a born again Christian. So he always tied it to the fact that the purpose there was to develop our community, to make our community become a developed society. Then we got into another phase in our life when we now went from CEO type to so broke that we didn't have any. At one point, for some months, at least a year, we didn't have a single working appliance in our house. No TV, no iron, nothing. The next phase. But in the midst of all that, we still had 13 people in the house. We had people from our community, whatever, who were going to school on us and stuff like that. So one also grew up knowing that you don't cut down on how you can bless people just because you have less money. So how does that tie into my life today? Then I became a Christian. And when I became a Christian, my church the church I became a Christian in was doing hearing God in that season. So it's kind of like I just became born again, hearing God, kind of. So I landed straight in the message that the pastor was preaching at that time. That I actually remember he used to quote in the volume of the book is written of me. He said Jesus said that he found himself in the book. You should find yourself in the book. So from day one, purpose was a big thing for me. So most of my movement was like praying from day one, Lord, what do you want me to do? I remember somebody offered me an opportunity to go study computer science, a master's degree in the UK. I had done that as a first degree in Nigeria. And just at that time, it was, what do you want me to do? So I prayed and I felt the Lord said to me, that's not for you. So I said no. So that was then purpose. But much later in life, I then got into business programs that actually taught purpose beyond profit as a subject and helped me to balance. At that time in church, those days, you would think purpose meant you had to be a missionary. And there's nothing wrong with being missionaries. We're all missionaries to an extent. But over time, I then balanced with the fact that God also loves profit, but he loves profit to come because of purpose. Whereas we tend to want to see profit as the world tends to want to see profit as the driving force, and then purpose might come if you're profitable. But the Lord wants you to have purpose, and then profit will come because you're purposeful. That's why it says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you.
I agree with you, but I want to piggyback a little on what you said in terms of the context of purpose and profit, because sometimes it feels like the world has tried to create some sense of stigma around purpose and profits, almost trying to connote that purpose can be a barrier to profit and not an enabler. And we know that we're not pushing purpose without profit. It's supposed to be profitable, but let purpose lead that. How do we reframe that? And I'd like you to answer this question by talking about the work that you do with Bees Community and Grow My Home. Is do you think with the businesses that you are set up, how does your purpose enable your profit, or has it at any point interfered with profit, and how do you navigate that?
So I think it's a multi-layered question. Some things require that you just have to do what the Bible says. So you have to not have the love of money. And if you have the love of money, there is no principle that will not be perverted. So we have to work on those as a basic, because that's what God demands of us. Secondly, on the one hand, we mustn't love money. But on the other hand, we must also know that profit is godly. He says it gives us the power to make wealth. Right. So having that balance, then the next thing we need to think about is that profit is not only financial. So some businesses will never make financial profit, because if we were only to do things that will make financial profit, there will be many locations in this world we will not do anything in. There are some places in this world where you cannot be profitable financially. And the only way you can measure profit in those places is other forms of profit. For example, if you're doing a healthcare business in a rural area, you have to measure profits in other ways other than money. So we also have to have a paradigm shift there. Some people in some industries also don't measure their profits financially. Evangelists measure their profit in terms of souls or people or stuff like that. That requires a paradigm shift. But coming back to money, because I guess your question, I believe your question is more of the financial profit. We do need to be able to realize that we must be that being financially profitable is godly. However, our mechanisms towards financial profitability, if you're doing purpose beyond profit, one very simple example is that your timelines for profitability have to be different. It's very difficult to do purpose beyond profit if you have a short-term timeline for money. You have to, you most of the time to be a successful purpose beyond profit practitioner in terms of financial profit, you have to be somebody that has a long-term mindset. That's very important, which ties into the fruit of the spirit called patience. Because some things are very profitable, but they only take time. I also do think one last thing that, and that ties back into the love of money. Sometimes we have to give up profit. It's the reality of being a child of God. Sometimes there is over profiteering. As a business person who runs a company where we buy things and sell, I have seen that you can make a 3% markup, a 30% markup, a 300% markup, a 3,000% markup. You can do business in a way that you really are taking advantage of people. It just becomes a matter of values where you want to stay. That's the reality. You can buy products and hoard them because you know people will suffer in 3 months' time, and then you sell them at 1,000% profit. It's still profit. But at some point, it just becomes between you and God or you and your values to know that, hey, this is excessive.
I'd like to zoom in closer on your businesses and that journey so far when it comes to Grow My Home, BizConnect. Can you tell us how the model works?
Yeah, okay. So stepping back a bit, I have a background in trade and investments, in international trade and investments. And so I've worked in organizations that have done big deals, multi-billion rand deals, closing between countries and all that. It always sounds so fancy. And I used to be one of the facilitators and all that. But one of the things that caught me immediately was that the impact is very little. Very few people. There will be this big signing, this big amount came, but when you look at it, very few people are being touched. If you look at a typical stock market in the country that hogs all the business news, for example, in West Africa, Nigerian stock market is the largest. There are 100 and something companies there. But meanwhile, there are hundreds of thousands, millions. I think they say there are 9 million businesses in Nigeria. So 0.0000001% is hogging all the space. So based on that, I got to a point somewhere around 2015 where I thought, while the big place has a lot of glamour, you meet all these supposed important people and stuff like that, and do all these deals, I felt it was not touching the real people. In the organization that I was leading, which was a member-based organization, I calculated it. I don't think up to 1% was being impacted by the resourcing. So that's when I just felt the Lord was nudging me to say, go into SME development and work with people at that level and grow. Now, my father had written a book. My father is somebody that influenced all of us a lot, but me a lot, because I grew up in the prime of his life. So his book was called Industrialization, Starting Small, Growing Big. So you remember I told you he was a CEO of a leading company, but he started that company from zero. He started from zero. So that had also shaped our minds that you start small and you can grow big. I actually redid the book, a modern version of the book. So that was the basis for starting Biz Connect Africa, was to pick small companies and then help them to grow. Not venture capital, where we are going to exit and sell. This is SME, where we are going to stay with you as long as possible until you became profitable. And not to go too long, we've had to change our models. Initially, we used to invest in the companies, but after some time, we found out that very many people actually need their mindsets to be shifted before you can give them money. An example is a transport company that we invested in. And the moment the guy got the money and bought the vehicles, he switched off his phone and just drove the car to his friend and his church and stuff like that, and didn't do business with the car. Nobody would have ever known that guy would behave like that. So over time, we shifted into a model where we would take ownership of the company and allow the people buy us out. We probably have about 14 businesses that we oversee, like social enterprises. Some we directly are involved, some are third parties, but we work with the leaders and the people who run every one of these businesses. At the start, I used to mentor them from the very basics, from basic things like running spreadsheets, reading spreadsheets, opening bank accounts. Some of these people never had bank accounts, etc. And we've grown them gradually. Some have grown faster than the others. However, to keep ourselves funded, we have cash cows. So those are because we're still business people and I still am an entrepreneur. And I still know, by the grace of God, I still know how to make money from a business. So the cash cows help us carry the long-term businesses. We've had success stories where long-term businesses have become profitable and become cash cows. We've had situations where formerly dead businesses have ended up sustaining the company. So that has been experienced. But we've also had very many that have not worked. So it's not like so these 14 have been the 14 out of the 100 that have survived. But Grow My Home is one of those businesses, and we founded that in 2023, and it's my core passion. It's real estate, but it's affordable real estate and home ownership. And the vision is just to be able to make it possible for people to have housing, especially in markets that have underdeveloped mortgage systems. Majority of Africans, I think just 3% of Africa as a whole has access to mortgages, and a majority of that population sits in South Africa. So if you take out South Africa, it's really, in one of these African countries, I think they say there are 50,000 mortgages in a country with a population of 40 million people. So how will these people have homes? They self-build, but most people can't. So that's where Grow My Home comes in, with mechanisms to teach them, to create systems, and then to create financing access for people to be able to buy these homes and live in them. It also involves working with people to transform their mindsets. We work with the homeowners, we train them, we consult with them, we work with their families, we put them through programs, we build something that is similar to a credit score. And then when they qualify, we give them access to a property, but it's like prepaid housing, so they are never in debt, with sufficient exit points to allow them to exit if they are troubled.
Sounds like a well thought out model and plan. What informs are there sectors that you focus on when it comes to Disconnect Africa? Because you said SME, so are there specific sectors as a result of maybe some research or guidance to say, okay, these are the sectors that we fund or we drive this SME mindset and business growth? Or is it open-ended? It's just about identifying the right SMEs and you shift their mindset and you also ensure that that translates to business success?
That's one of the reasons why real estate is a big thing for us. What we now do is we bring the investors' money to real estate. So there is always every investor funding or every cash cow or every partner's funds we have always goes into a real asset that has value, at the very least can always be liquidated, and that is earning. Then the businesses we do span out of that. So that brings us to the second part. All the businesses are in the real estate value chain, directly or indirectly. So skills, hospitality, a hospitality company can use our buildings to run hospitality. We do some of that. Training, skills academies, train people, train workers. Food companies feed people who work. Cleaning companies clean estates if you build an estate, etc., etc., etc. So we can then support the SMEs there with a guarantee that there is at least basic work for them to do for us or our real estate, and then they can grow to third-party work.
One last question on this. If you were to advise a young budding entrepreneur in this part of the continent, being West Africa, who wants to start out doing business, and you were to advise him or her, they get some time to sit down with you and they're asking you for the risks that they should look out for and the ones that they should avoid, and just generally how they should approach risk taking in business as they start out.
When I was younger, I would have said to them, go and start your business. Now I realize that for some people, maybe after doing a personality test, you should tell them to go and work for somebody to develop certain skills around discipline and commitment before they try to run their thing. So that's another piece of advice I would give those young entrepreneurs. I would also say to people that it is very fulfilling to pursue your enterprise. It actually is extremely fulfilling. Once you can pay the bills, you notice how fulfilled you are. It's only when you can't pay the bills that you forget how fulfilling it is. But that not everybody is meant to be an entrepreneur. Some people are meant to support and partner in a business while working. They're not entrepreneur. Enterprise is not everyone is cut out to be an entrepreneur. My wife is not cut out to be an entrepreneur. And having been married to her for 20 something years, I know she shouldn't try to run a business, no matter how nicely you spin it. But she can be an investor in a business, and a very good investor. Actually, she can ask the right questions and keep me in check, or keep you in check at times. So I would say to some of those people, you should check where you are. Some of the geographical risks you have to watch out for in a West African context, from my experience, macroeconomic risks are a big one. So, for instance, in our years of doing Base Connect Africa, when we used to really concentrate on selling equipment and all that, you always had to hedge against currency risk. In Nigeria, that was our biggest market. There is always a major devaluation every few years, currency devaluation, and it wipes out. So you always have to watch out for currency risk, and you have to learn how to hedge currency. You have to actually understand how the currency works and how to hedge. That's a very big one. And then logistics related to infrastructure is a big one. Yes, there have been improvements. There were times when our containers used to stay in the seaport for 3 months, but now we get it out much faster. But you always have to factor in the fact that there could be hiccups, there could be issues in the transporting or in logistics or infrastructure related issues. So that's why we always say plan for those hiccups. Plan for it. Actually, don't run with plans that assume everything is perfect. Run with plans that assume that there could be those hiccups. So those are examples, and then social factors. And what I mean by social factors is in some of the parts of the world where we do business, human resources is one of the biggest risks, actually. We have a problem with work code, work ethics in West Africa. We have a major problem with work ethics. If you're not dealing with people, dealing with the issues that have to do with simple things like timeliness, you're dealing with shrinkage, you're dealing with some cultures in some parts, this is not everywhere, but in some parts, who actually think culturally that shrinkage is the right way to go. We actually, in one place, and I won't mention where, in one place in West Africa, they actually have a saying that you eat another person's wealth to grow. Right. So those kind of wrong mindsets entrench shrinkage, right up to peop lack of adherence to contracts, or just seeing the contract as a piece of paper. It's not, we don't have to adhere to it. So these are serious factors that will impact your business. So lack of knowledge, educated people who don't know what they learned in school. There are people who studied technology, let's say computer science, and they never used a computer. So those are all human resource risks when you're starting a business. There are some parts of the continent where you can work in and you have a lot of community unrest. And it doesn't let you get work done because the community does not let you get work done. You have to manage that. Yes. So these are all risk factors you have. And I think that's the biggest factor. But I also want to balance so that I'm on record balancing that. All of this risk can be managed. And I believe that purpose beyond profit is actually the solution to managing all of them. I actually believe that unrest in a lot of the communities in Africa, in Nigeria, for example, is because of broken trusts, because of piles and piles of injustice. And that a person or a company or a business that practices the concept of purpose beyond profit, you might struggle at the first time because nobody will trust you. But once you can prove it, is the solution to some of those problems. Once there is a buy-in, these people, and I have examples, our company has examples there too, where we have struggled with the community, seriously had community fights to the extent where they put muti, put it in the place that anybody that goes to work will die. And all our workers run away and nobody comes to work. And just my brother and my lawyer, who are both Christians, they actually go into the place and remove the muti and throw it away. They prayed and remove it and throw it away. And then everybody stopped. Somebody actually sees that and runs to phone my parents to say, your son is taking out muti. That muti kills people historically. And my mom is in panic and all that. And everybody watches them and nobody falls dead. To later on, where that community, we have actually like a special pass in that community now. Because they've come to say that, wow, we really mean well for the community. We do training programs and we ask every family to send us a representative. Some of these representatives don't know how to build. We train them from scratch and make them qualified builders. We give them work. Yeah, so it can be done, so I just needed to balance that. We can manage those things. It's challenging, very challenging, but they can be done successfully.
So in essence, thank you so much, Nissi. In essence, you're saying that within some of the prevalent risks that you have identified also lies the solutions or potential solutions. Honestly, I have nothing further to add to that. This has been a very insightful and engaging conversation. I have enjoyed this discussion. And I don't know if is there anything else you'd like to add before we close out this podcast?
Well, having had a history of working with investors who are non-West Africans, I also do know that you have to manage their thinking and perception about risk. Understanding West Africa is key. But even when you are Black African from Southern Africa or Eastern Africa and you're going to Nigeria, our behavior, approach, and cultures are so significantly different that if you don't invest in understanding the other side of the coin, there will be conflict. So that one way to manage risk, if you have to go to West Africa, is to learn to understand where their perspective and where they're coming from.
Thank you for that, Nissi. I hear you. I mean, for someone like me that works in the international development space across the continent and beyond, I know for sure that cultural nuances and matters a lot when it comes to engaging to get anything done, whether it's as entrepreneurs or as development professionals. Thank you very much. This has been a very, very engaging conversation. Thank you for your time, Nissi. Thank you to our listeners, and thank you for a great conversation. And enjoy the rest of your day until next time.
Right. Thank you, Chinwe. You too. Have a good day.
Thank you for joining us. This episode of Reframed was brought to you by Ziwani, a community of business leaders who partner together to live out their kingdom calling in the marketplace within Africa. To know more about us, visit our website at ziwani.com. That's ziwani.com.